Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to all of you. Welcome to this session on the epidemiology of substance use disorders in the Middle East region with implications for psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, and other clinicians in the community. I'm Jawad Hashim. I'm an associate professor of family medicine and a clinical epidemiologist at the College of Medicine and Health Sciences, United Arab Emirates in the beautiful city of Al Ain. I don't have any conflicts of interest disclosures to make. I do teach at the College of Medicine and Health Sciences at United Arab Emirates University, showing now our beautiful campus in the city of Al Ain, about 100 kilometers from Dubai or Abu Dhabi, and all of you are welcome to visit us. We graduate about 100 medical students every year. These are our learning objectives for this session. We'll be talking about the most commonly abused drugs in the Middle East region, talking about the trends of substance abuse and comparing these trends with other regions in the world to give us some perspective and context. The background of this presentation, and I don't need to discuss this in detail with this audience, substance abuse disorders have a profound impact on the person, the family, and the society, disrupting their social lives, the occupation, personal productivity, performance, and often leading to significant mental and physical disorders. Epidemiological studies, such as what I'm going to discuss right now, of these disorders can guide clinical care and inform policies to mitigate the impact of substance abuse in a community. So these can help us know what's the current clinical situation in a community regarding substance abuse, and we can subsequently plan and guide clinical care based on that. The Middle East region, with more than 20 Arab countries and a population of 371 million, has been relatively understudied in terms of substance use disorders. So if you look at research publications coming from this region on substance use, there's a relative paucity compared to other regions. And that limits our insight into what is happening. Our aims for today are to analyze the burden of substance use disorders in this region over the last 3 decades, to assess the changing need for drug rehab services. For this study, I used the Global Burden of Disease dataset, in which there are data metrics for prevalence, incidence, and mortality for the Middle East region. This dataset is maintained by the Institute of Health Metrics at the University of Washington, Seattle. And I would encourage you to take a look at this data set to again look at how the patterns are changing and to look at specific countries if you're interested. The website is given on this slide, healthdata.org. It's interesting to note that this database includes a certain group of countries in the designation of North Africa and Middle East. And this includes, interestingly, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and does not include Israel. So the results from this database showed that the prevalence of substance use disorders in the Middle East region is about 483 persons per 100,000 population, 2019. And this has increased significantly, 42% increase compared to 1990. So a rising trend. In particular, Libya has experienced a 3-fold increase in prevalence and has one of the highest rates now in the region in terms of substance abuse. Males are more likely to use psychoactive substances with a peak prevalence in the 20 to 30-year age group. Alcohol remains the most commonly abused substance, no surprise there, followed by opioids and cannabis or hashish. Amphetamines and cocaine are less commonly used in this region compared to other parts of the world. Okay, so this slide shows the global burden of disease in terms of what are called DALYs, disability adjusted life years. DALYs represent not only just prevalence of a disease, but also the disability caused by it and the years of life lost due to a disease. And this slide provides a nice overview of which diseases are causing the most suffering worldwide. And I would like to draw your attention to the substance abuse rectangle right here at the bottom, The area of each rectangle corresponds to the burden of disease or the number of DALYs due to that disease. So you can see substance abuse disorders, although not the biggest or the most common, still have a significant impact worldwide on human health. If we drill down and take a more detailed look, you can still see substance abuse right here at the lower part of this heat map, and you can see that now it has been divided into drugs and alcohol, and I'd like you to just note that both drugs and alcohol seem to contribute almost equally in terms of disability-adjusted life years worldwide. Now, if we compare this to the Middle East region, you can see the rectangle is slightly smaller, indicating a slightly smaller footprint of substance abuse in this region. Alcohol rectangle becoming substantially smaller, and the drugs rectangle taking a bigger proportion of substance abuse. Notice, of course, that conflict issues also play a prominent role in this region, causing significant health impact. This is a world map showing substance use disorders for all ages from 2019, and it shows a prevalence level. The color coding is based on red, showing the highest prevalence, followed by orange and yellow hues, and then ending with light blue and dark blue colors. So it is obvious from the map that certain regions of the world have higher prevalence of drug abuse, such as the US, Europe, and Russia, whereas there's a lower prevalence of drug abuse in countries in Africa and South Asia. If we zoom in onto the Middle East region, see that certain countries have slightly higher prevalence as compared to others. For reference, India is showing higher rates here, as well as countries such as Eritrea, and we'll take a closer look in a table for this data. In terms of world rankings, the Middle East and North Africa region actually have the lowest prevalence of substance use disorder, and this has been stable from 1990 to the current data from 2019. So high-income countries in Europe and North America have the highest rates of substance use disorders. And if you look at the specific countries, you can see here that there are no countries from the Middle East region in the top 28 countries for substance use disorders from 2019. And again, this is very instructive to see, to give us a context and see which countries have high substance use disorders. And one thing that struck me was that substance use disorders in this study includes alcohol. So I was wondering if it was alcohol that was contributing to high rates, and maybe if we removed alcohol, we would see a different picture. When I ranked all the countries based on drug abuse disorders with alcohol excluded, the picture did not change much actually, and the top countries included US, Canada, Australia, and United Kingdom. And again, we see one Middle East country, Libya, now entering the ranks in the top 25, but still countries from the Middle East region not figuring in the top countries for drug use disorders. If we focus just on the Middle East region, you can see here that certain countries, which tend to be those countries that have a higher affluence or socioeconomic development, tend to have higher rates of substance use disorders. And you will notice that certain countries have increased in rankings over the last 30 years. In terms of which substances are being abused in this region, the rankings are fairly stable. Alcohol remains at the top, followed by opioids, and then cannabis use. Amphetamine, cocaine, and other drug use disorders are relatively less common. And this is shown in this graph, which shows the number of prevalent cases per 100,000 for alcohol, opioids, and cannabis, which are relatively higher compared to amphetamines and cocaine use in this region. I want to compare this with the rates in the US, and notice that the rates are much higher in the US on the left vertical axis. Also notice that the rates for cocaine and amphetamine use are much higher there as well. In terms of age distribution, the most common ages seem to be between 20 to 40 years. So young adults experimenting and becoming dependent. What is concerning is the increasing use of drugs experimentation among young adolescents in this region. This is something that we need to watch for very carefully. Males, of course, have a higher rate of substance use disorder than females, and this appears to be a global trend. If we look at the rates over time, we can see that the Middle East region is experiencing rise from 1990 to 2019. The rise is gradual, but nevertheless, it is a concerning rising trend as compared to the global average, which actually seems to be coming down slightly over the last couple of decades. However, it's still instructive to compare these rates in drug abuse. And here you can see it gives you a perspective that the Middle East region still has a lower rate of drug abuse compared to other regions. So in conclusion, we see that substance abuse disorders are rising slowly but gradually over the last 3 decades in the Middle East region. Rates are lower compared to other world regions, especially high-income countries in Europe and North America. Commonly abused drugs include alcohol, opiates, and cannabis. Based on these findings, some recommendations can be made for this region for health policymakers. The need for rehabilitation care is going to be increasing, and this is something that is familiar to all of us as clinicians. Community services for relapse prevention, community awareness, and prevention activities to reduce the burden are important. So all three are essential to curb the rising trend in substance abuse in this region. And finally, healthcare professionals need to be better educated in identifying, referring, and managing persons with this disorder, as well as being involved in community activities for relapse prevention and general prevention. Some of my references for this presentation. With this, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you found this useful.
Hello, this is Dr. Alia Magdi. I am a psychiatrist and a lecturer of psychiatry in Cairo University. And today I will be discussing serum oxytocin level among male patients with opioid dependence and its relation to craving. So I'll start with the learning objectives. This presentation is to mainly identify the relationship between oxytocin and addictive disorders. We will discuss how oxytocin affects drug priming, how it affects the addictive process, and the withdrawal as well. We will also explain the effect of oxytocin on craving, since it's an important factor in most addictive problems and with substance use disorders, and how oxytocin can actually be implemented in the management of opioid use disorders. So oxytocin, as most of us know, is a peptide hormone that is normally produced in the hypothalamus in the brain, as seen in this picture, supraorbital nucleus and paraventricular nucleus, and it gets stored long down into the posterior pituitary when it gets secreted to the bloodstream. So again, it is produced in the hypothalamus, it is stored and released by the posterior pituitary gland in the brain. The functions of oxytocin are most commonly known by milk ejection, let down, uterine contraction, and labor. And it has lately been a wide area of investigation to see its effect on social bonding, on behavioral homeostasis, how it affects learning and memory, and how it affects how individuals act and react with each other, which made us start. This is another slide to explain what triggers oxytocin release. Again, it's a positive physical contact, sex, social bonding, and breastfeeding and childbirth. So when scientists started to know that oxytocin is related to behavior and to behavioral homeostasis, we started to explore how can this affect addictive drug behavior, and how the drugs actually control behavior and how they are connected to each other. Earlier studies came from a scientist named Kovacs who worked with mice. What Kovacs did was he started to inject oxytocin in a dose-dependent manner. And what he found was that when he injected those mice with oxytocin, the rapid and chronic tolerance to the analgesia of morphine and beta endorphin was delayed, meaning that it took them more time and more in a higher dose to actually cause tolerance in these mice. Another thing that he did was when he precipitated withdrawal by naloxone, when he worked with mice who were addicted to morphine, beta endorphins, and heroin. So when he started to give naloxone to precipitate a withdrawal reaction, and he administered oxytocin, the effect and the withdrawal reaction itself was less. So it was found that oxytocin affects both the tolerance and how the priming happens and the tolerance to effects of the drug, and it actually reduced the withdrawal reaction. So it was found to benefit both ways. So this is the conclusion, that it is likely that oxytocin interfered with the development of physical dependence. So when withdrawal was precipitated, the signs were less severe and it was less affecting them. Another study found that when withdrawal was precipitated by naloxone, and they measured the oxytocin levels in the CSF of the opioid-dependent rats, it was found that actually after withdrawal, there was an increase in the oxytocin levels. So this was a preliminary study from which we started to develop the idea that maybe they are inversely related to each other. So when we give opioids, the oxytocin levels in the CSF decrease. When we stop it, the levels start to increase back. So in terms of addiction, we started to research and to try to understand the relationship between oxytocin and dopamine, since dopamine is the main neurotransmitter that is related to addiction, addictive process, and to the pleasure. This is it's like a map to different parts of the brain with different receptors and how they are related to each other. So oxytocin, the ones in the purple are the oxytocin, the projection. So it shows that supraorbital nucleus and paraventricular nucleus are related to amygdala, to the nucleus accumbens, which is responsible for the pleasurable feeling. It is related to the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, as seen here, to the hippocampus, which is responsible for the memory and for the learning of the addiction. And when they studied the other way around, they found that oxytocin receptors are present on each and every one of those. So they are connected back and forth. They all go to the VTA, where dopamine is produced and where dopamine is produced and where dopamine exerts its effect. And they are connected back and forth. So dopamine affects oxytocin and oxytocin affects dopamine. So again, this made us think more that addiction is related to not only dopamine, but other factors also affected. And since oxytocin is what we're talking about, it is proved this way. So after further studies and later on, we found that oxytocin is related to three parts: the early drug experiences, the progression to addiction, and the drug cessation or the withdrawal. We'll discuss first the early drug experiences, where oxytocin was found to affect the adaptation phase. Earlier, when they studied on the mice, we found that when oxytocin was administered to the mice or to the rats before giving the morphine, before giving the opioids, and later on we start giving them the drug, the reinforcing effect of the drug was reduced. So they did not feel the same feeling they used to feel before giving the oxytocin. The novelty-seeking preference, the wish and the care to seek and to find the substance was reduced. So we concluded that oxytocin, if present in proper amounts, or if it is administered, whether it's internal, whether it's endogenous or exogenous, they both affect the impact and the negative effect and the reinforcing effect of the drug. So it also increased the social stimuli and the social, like how they bond with each other. So this again will reduce the need to take an opioid. When it comes to the progression to addiction, as mentioned before, tolerance was reduced, the withdrawal symptoms was reduced, so the negative effect of the substance or the opioids was actually reduced. It was also found that oxytocin levels in the brain by time when a person or an organism is dependent on any opioids is reduced. This reduction in oxytocin is actually something that also can explain that by time people who are dependent on substance, people who abuse opioids, start to have an impaired social and emotional capability. They start to care less for people. They start to not want to take with, if they take with their friends, they start to take alone. The salience effect of the drugs, the emotional effect, they start to have negative emotions and null emotions. It affects them not only in terms of taking a drug and physically depending on it, it also affects how they act and react with other people. When we're talking about post-therapy or post-treatment and stopping the drug, oxytocin was found to reduce the effect of craving in heroin. And this is a very important thing because when we think of long-term treatment to heroin-dependent patients and to opioid-addicted patients, we start to know that one of the biggest problems we are facing is craving, and stress causes them to crave the substance because this is how they deal with stress. So when giving oxytocin, it was found that this negative effect and the craving effect was reduced, which will help them be abstinent for longer times. So again, it was found to affect the neuroadaptation phase, the early experiences. It was found to impair and to reduce the tolerance and to reduce the withdrawal symptoms. And after treatment, it was found to reduce the craving. So it's all beneficiary. So again, since stress is a very, very important factor in relapse and in craving, it was concluded that oxytocin actually may be used to reduce the relapse rates and to improve the craving effect to addicted patients through the hypothalamo-pituitary-adrenal axis, because stress is related to negative effects and negative effects is related to craving, and craving is a very important risk factor for the drug relapse and to take it again. Our study was to try to link stress, craving, and addiction to each other with oxytocin, because when we researched, we found a gap in literature discussing this very precise molecular mechanism and how they are actually affected. So we decided to do the study on heroin-dependent patients. The aim was to actually measure the oxytocin level in patients who are actively opioid dependent currently and to compare them with abstinent patients to see what's the difference in their oxytocin levels and to compare both of them with healthy controls. So it was like we want to see how oxytocin is affected in people who are currently taking heroin to people who stopped taking heroin to people who never took heroin. And our hypothesis was built on the previous studies, which showed that oxytocin level was reduced in the CSF of mice. So we started to make a hypothesis that it probably is related and that oxytocin level in patients who are currently active is lower than healthy controls and to people who actually stopped taking opioids, and that this is negatively or inversely related to craving. So when craving is high, oxytocin is probably low and vice versa. We took a sample of 30 opioid-dependent patients fulfilling DSM-5 criteria, and we compared them to people who were at least 6 months abstinent regarding the oxytocin levels and the craving levels. And we compared both of them to a sample of 30 healthy controls who are matching sociodemographics, and we wanted to see what's the difference between the three groups. Our results showed that there was a statistically significant difference between patient groups and between both the controls and people who were abstinent. The good news was that the serum oxytocin level of the patients who actually stopped, the abstinent patients and the controls, there was no much of a significance. They were still different, but it was more or less the same. There was no statistical significant difference. And this shows that people, when remain abstinent for quite some time, their oxytocin levels start to get back to normal, and hence they start to get better. In addition, we found the craving levels was statistically significant, and there was a very big difference between the patient group and the abstinent groups. So this again makes sense, because if by time oxytocin starts to get back to normal and patients are getting better, so their craving levels should be better. The correlation we did was between the oxytocin level and the craving, and a negative correlation was found, which goes back with our hypothesis that probably oxytocin is related to craving. So when oxytocin levels are okay within the normal level, the craving is reduced. So the conclusion we came up with was that the interaction between serum oxytocin levels and craving should be really considered when dealing with opioid-dependent patients, because if we're talking about further studies and if we're talking about how can this actually benefit the patients, we were thinking that, and actually some studies started to do that, to inject or to give patients who are trying to remain abstinent oxytocin to reduce the negative effect of craving and hence improve their relapse rates. This is a picture from papers who are actually starting to work with intranasal oxytocin for management of opioid-dependent patients, and it's being studied to work with other substance use disorders, not only opioids. So these are the references. I hope that you understood the idea of what we did, and thank you very much.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Esther, and I'm based in Norway. I just want to start by saying that I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be here today to share my research. Today, I will be presenting one of my thesis papers. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Mental Health and Substance Abuse at the University of Southeast Norway, and I will be talking about the paper that I published last year. So the name of my project is Experiences of Social Recovery and Social Inclusion in Co-occurring Mental Health and Substance Abuse Problem. Recovery is usually described as a clinical outcome or as a social or personal process. In this project, the focus is on recovery as a social process. And I made this decision because although recovery has received a growing interest in health services for the past decades, the social aspect of recovery has remained a relatively neglected dimension. Under the framework of social recovery, the focus is on the collective culture within a community or country. It focuses on the person's everyday life context, human relations, and life condition. The contribution of other persons, the community, and contextual factors is also seen as important. In this paper, social recovery is discussed in tandem with social inclusion, and this is being done in order to gain a broader understanding of both concepts. Focusing on social inclusion is seen as important in this context because persons experiencing co-occurring mental health and substance abuse problems are also more likely to experience social inclusion in their everyday life. And one of these areas is with respect to housing. Attempts to include this group have primarily involved assigning supporting housing. Yet the situation of housing and persons experiencing co-occurring problems remains one of the least understood and most contested problems in health services. Underpinning this project is the understanding that social inclusion entails experiencing a sense of belonging, having the opportunity to participate in the community, and experiencing citizenship within the community. The research context is a supporting housing site in Oslo municipality, and the study had a qualitative and collaborative design. The research questions were, how do residents with co-occurring mental health and substance abuse problem experience belonging? And how does residential support staff experience promoting a sense of belonging for residents with co-occurring problems? I conducted 5 semi-structured individual interviews with residents experiencing co-occurring problems, and along with a second moderator, 1 focus group interview with 9 residential support staff. Brown and Clark's approach to thematic analysis was carried out with an advisory group. The group consisted of residential support staff and residents with co-occurring problems, as well as quantitative and qualitative resources. The process of analysis resulted into 3 themes. I do not go to sleep in my pajamas. Do I have a choice? And be kind to each other. I do not go to sleep in my pajamas. In this theme shows how belonging can be a dynamic experience in the sense that one's social environment can either contribute or hinder individual feelings of belonging. It captures residents' examples of how fellow residents' behavior create a situation within the house that led to feelings of insecurity and limited participants, opportunities to do things one would typically expect to be able to do in one's home. This resulted in a lack of sense of home and belonging. I will now read the quote from one resident. I do not go to sleep in my pajamas in the bedroom. I'm always on guard, and it affects me. I constantly feel afraid because there have been burglary attempts here and such, and I had to call the police and such. So I'm always on guard. That is why I don't wear the pajamas. I'm fully dressed, ready to run out or call the police. This theme also shows how fellow residents had an impact on staff efforts to promote belonging. Do I have a choice? In this theme, the importance of choice and resources for experience of belonging was stressed. Staff viewed belonging as something that one could choose for oneself, and when that was the case, a good experience, then belonging would be a good experience. But staff also saw belonging as something that could be assigned by others and contextual factors. And in those cases, belonging would be experienced as something unfavorable. The latter understanding of belonging was also seen in residents' accounts with respect to being assigned supporting housing. One resident explained how she had received 2 housing offers, but did not really like any of them, and she did not like the location either. She emphasized that the choice was inadequate, which made her feel like she didn't really have a choice. I will now read what she said in her own words. I got an offer of a supporting housing, which was in street name. I then inquired before going to the housing office. Then she told me that it was a ghetto. And then I thought, okay, supporting housing here at the house or supporting housing there? Here, after all, there are people downstairs. If there's any trouble, then security guard is downstairs. While at the other place, lots of drunks and crabs and police and mystery and nothing else. So that place wasn't acceptable for me. So then I thought I would rather live here. Residents explain how not choosing or having a good choice regarding what community one wants to belong to led to feelings of exclusion. Staff promoted experience of belonging by helping residents regain resources so that residents could reclaim a choice and decide where to belong, which in this case meant where to live and what community to be a part of. The last theme is called Be Kind to Each Other, and it got this name because when we ask residents what can be done to increase your sense of belonging, and as staff what is needed to promote good experiences of belonging, both groups emphasize starting with basic human values that are often taken for granted, such as being kind and loving. This is what one resident had to say. We need to try to care about each other and understand that we live here and that the house should be a safe place. I might go and tag peace and love on the wall and stuff. Be kind to each other. We have to care. Now is the time. The plea to care for one another and to be kind to each other was called for within the house, but also outside of the house and towards the local and wider community. Our participants stressed the necessity of a continuous effort from everyone and asked that we come together as a society on all levels and start by being kind to each other. By adopting a broader understanding of social inclusion, one which entails experiences of belonging, our study indicates that assigning supporting housing may not necessarily be a measure of inclusion. This is noteworthy as assigning supporting housing is often thought to be just that, both in Norwegian and international guidelines. So now what? This study indicates that experiences and promotion of belonging did not exist in a vacuum, but were influenced by contextual factors and the participants' community. This speaks to the necessity of introducing practices that consider communal and contextual factors while assigning a place of residence. An example of this can be taken into consideration residents' perception of the local community. Our study also underlined the importance of a collective responsibility and endeavor to create a society that facilitates inclusion. This finding is also noteworthy as there have been an increasing focus on what constitutes a recovery-oriented health services, but less focus on what constitutes a recovery-oriented society. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Bhavika Vachawat, Senior Resident in Forensic Psychiatry at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, Bengaluru, India. The title for today's oral presentation is Clinical Outcomes of Patients with Mental Illness Charged with Homicide, Insights from India. The co-authors for this study are Dr. Naveen, Dr. Prakhya, Dr. Sydney, Dr. Vinay, Dr. Pratyusha, Dr. Binu, Dr. Suresh Padamat, and Dr. Pratima Murthy. We do not have any conflict of interest. The learning objectives are to identify the clinical profile, clinical course, and long-term clinical outcomes of prisoners with mental illness, and to discuss a service provision model for prisoners with mental illness. Now, there have been various studies which have found that prisons have a disproportionately high prevalence of mental illness across the globe. Now, there are various factors that have been attributed to this high prevalence, such as trans-institutionalization, imputation hypothesis, and psychosocial adversities in the prison. However, it is important to acknowledge that every prisoner has a right to care and treatment, which has been granted by various national and international conventions. As per the Indian law, we have the Mental Health Care Act of 2017, which provides standards and procedures of mental health services in prisons under Section 103, subsection 7 of Mental Health Care Act. Despite this, the treatment of prisoners with mental illness might be hampered due to the lack of available resources in prison, particularly in low and middle income countries. Now, the complexity further increases because prisoners with serious charges such as homicide have even lesser social support system due to perceived dangerousness, stigma, and the lengthy legal proceedings. The prevalence of mental illness in homicide perpetrators ranges widely between 4 to 40%, and little is known about what happens to their clinical condition in the long run. Studies from the western part of the world with follow-up periods ranging between 3 to 29 years have found that hospital readmission rates of homicide offenders is as high as 33 to 80%. Having established this issue of clinical deterioration among prisoners longitudinally, and that similar studies are lacking from a low and middle income country, the objective of this study, the study was conceptualized and undertaken to explore the clinical course and outcomes of male inpatients with charges of homicide in forensic psychiatric settings. So we did a retrospective chart review of patients who were admitted in prison psychiatry ward of a tertiary care hospital in South India. And this study was undertaken in the year 2018 to 19. And we looked at all the admissions between 2003 and 2016. To give a background, tertiary care hospital has both inpatient and outpatient based services, and it receives referrals from prisoners throughout the state of Karnataka, which has around 49 correctional settings. So all these prisons or sub-jails or central prisons from different parts of the state refer their patients to Bangalore Central Prison. From there, they are subsequently referred to the tertiary care hospital. In the current study, 60% of the subjects were these en route prisoners who were referred from various parts of the state to the Bangalore Central Prison. And 40% of the subjects were uh, those whose primary prison was Bengaluru Central Prison itself, which houses around 5,250 prisoners. And in terms of the profile of the patients referred to the TCH, both under trial and convicted prisoners are referred, and a psychiatrist admits them based on the clinical complexities involved in the case management and or in the presence of court orders. So all males above the age of 18 years who fulfilled the ICD-10 criteria for a psychiatric diagnosis, who had charges of homicide, were included in the study, and those who did not have diagnosable psychiatric conditions such as malingering were excluded. In terms of the procedure employed, so basically the admission intake register of the male forensic psychiatry ward was reviewed. There were 530 admissions between 2003 and 2016, out of which, after accounting for repeat admissions, we had a total of 418 individuals, out of which 53 individuals' files could not be traced. So we had 365, out of which 231 had charges other than homicide, and 9 of them did not have a diagnosable psychiatric condition. So we were left with 125 subjects who were included in the study. In terms of the assessment tool, the modified version of structured data extraction tool, which was devised by Kumar et al., was used. And to ascertain the clinical severity of symptoms, all the follow-up dates and the clinical global impression severity scale CGI-S scores were used at each follow-up of the patient that were obtained based on the clinical notes by a psychiatrist, BV, and this scoring was supervised by a consultant psychiatrist, CNK. In terms of the statistical analysis, the normality of the continuous variables was assessed using Shapiro-Wilk test. As the variables were skewed, we used median to report the average. And the follow-up information up to 15 years was available only for the 34 subjects. So for the remaining 91, we used the last observation carried forward principle. To assess the change in the CGI-S scores over the follow-up period, we used the Friedman test with Dunn's post hoc test. And we did the analysis for the 34 subjects who had complete follow-up details of 15 years. And we also looked at the trend of change in the CGI scores for the remaining 125 subjects to compare it with the subjects who had complete data. And the change in the CGI scores was also assessed for each diagnostic group considered in the present study, and the study was approved by ethics committee. In terms of the results, the socio-demographic profile and the baseline referral status has been depicted. It is interesting to know that for about 63.2% of the patients, there were no relatives or caregivers available to provide any kind of information during the inpatient stay. It was only the patient who provided the information. And about 3/4 of the subjects had court orders due to which they were referred to a tertiary care hospital. In terms of the distribution of psychiatric diagnosis, interestingly, 87.2% did not have a past history of any psychiatric illness. Close to half of them had the diagnosis of schizophrenia spectrum disorders, 17.6 had mood disorders, and 32.8 had other disorders in which adjustment disorder, OCD, and dissociative disorders had been classified. In terms of the distribution of comorbid substance use, about half of them had tobacco dependence, 35.2% had alcohol dependence, and 28% had cannabis dependence. And the duration of illness before the first contact with the TCH was 75 days. In terms of the duration of contact with the TCH, it was defined as a period between the admission to the hospital to the last follow-up, which could have been either as an inpatient or on outpatient basis. and the average duration of contact was 24 months. And patients with follow-up periods up to 1, 5, and 15 years were 100%, 58.4, and 27.2% respectively. And the average number of admissions was 1. Interestingly, 32.8% of the subjects had at least one readmission during the follow-up period. I mean, the entire study period. And the reasons for the readmission was mainly self-harm attempts, recurrence or relapse of symptoms, assessment of fitness, and substance-related behavioral disturbances. In terms of the change in the CGI-S scores, we see that at baseline, the CGI scores was 5, which is indicative of being markedly ill. And over the period of 1, 5, and 15 years, we see that there was a significant decline in the CGI-S scores. And as multiple comparisons were done, we also did a post hoc analysis to correct the multiple comparisons. And still, the results remain significant with p-value less than 0.001. Now, this information is available for the 34 subjects for whom the complete information was available, and overall for the 125 subjects. And we see similar trends in both. In terms of considering the individual diagnosis or the diagnostic subgroups, we have the schizophrenia and the related disorders, mood disorders, and other disorders, which includes adjustment, dissociative, and OCD. So we see a similar pattern of fall in the CGI-S scores from the baseline to year 1, 5, and 15 years. So to the best of our knowledge, this is the first longitudinal study on the longitudinal clinical outcomes of patients admitted to forensic psychiatry ward in India. In terms of the socio-demographic profile and the diagnosis, the findings were consistent with the earlier studies, but what was interesting was to note that the readmission rates were almost 1/3 over 15 years of follow-up period. But if you look at the readmission rates from the studies that are done in the Western context, we see that like a previous study reported readmission rates of 33% within 2 years of discharge and 80% readmission rate within 15 years of discharge. So the higher rates of readmission in Western countries could be simply because forensic psychiatric services differ in developed countries, which offer closer supervision of patients in the community. And most of the studies done in the developed countries have looked at the clinical course post-discharge from prison when the patient is either acquitted or has obtained a conditional discharge. Unlike in the study wherein an individual was sent back to the Bangalore Central Prison after discharge from the hospital setting. Now, the study shows favorable clinical outcomes of prisoners with mental illness in terms of improvement in the severity of the illness and lower readmission rates across all diagnostic categories. And the possible factors could be the availability of psychiatrists in the prison, who do regular screening, prompt referrals, and provide supervised treatment to patients, and effective collaborative liaison psychiatric services with mental health establishments outside the prison. So through this study, we recommend that prison settings need to have networking and collaborative liaison psychiatric services with mental health establishments for seamless availability of treatment of prisoners afflicted with mental illness, and mandatory screening of prisoners for mental illness and substance use, and timely initiation of treatment. Now, it is a first real-world longitudinal comprehensive study on the clinical outcomes of patients admitted to forensic psychiatric ward with a long follow-up period of 15 years. It has a large sample size, and we did not have any pre-formulated hypothesis. It was an explorative study, thereby preventing any form of investigative bias. However, it comes with a few limitations, such as the retrospective nature of the assessment. The study was limited to prisoners with charges of homicide alone. Female subjects were not included due to the absence of a registry exclusive for female prison patients at the TCH, and may have Bergsonian bias, as the study was conducted in a tertiary care center where patients with greater clinical complexities are usually referred. In conclusion, schizophrenia, mood, and substance use disorders are common psychiatric diagnoses among male inpatients with mental illness with charges of homicide. The study shows favorable clinical outcomes in terms of improvement in the severity of illness and lower readmission rates, which has been noted across all diagnostic categories. And through this study, we recommend effective networking and collaborative psychiatric services between prisons and mental health establishments. However, prospective studies for more systematic understanding of the nuances of their care are important, and these services need further improvisation at various levels and generalization to other parts of the country. And one way forward is telemedicine and capacity building, which would help bridge this gap. These are my references. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. My name is Barbara D'Avanzo. I'm from Milan, and I work in the Mario Negri Institute for Pharmacological Research. I'm the chairperson of this session of oral presentations, and the first presentation is just mine. And it is entitled Effective Coverage for Patients with Schizophrenia Disorders, a study based on real world data. The finding of this, trying to go to the next slide, but maybe it's quite slow. The findings of this study were presented in a paper published this year in social psychiatry and psychiatric epidemiology. And we are presenting data derived from real world data. This means that these data are derived from administrative databases and are elaborated in order to answer to questions, to research questions. Why to use real-world data? We need to continuously monitor activities and outcomes in mental health care. And real-world data are useful in order to have an idea of what happens in real practice and in the real life of services. We need to conduct benchmarking. So benchmarking across services, professionals, areas, countries. And we also need to sustain accountability. So people, providers, people who work in the services with different roles and different responsibility have to take the full responsibility for what they done at their, of course, at their level of responsibility. But we also want to change things. But to change things, we need to know what happens in practice and what can be implemented in practice. In Italy, the healthcare system is a universalistic one, and mental health services are entirely based on community services. Why do we want to, did we use this real world data? We derived indicators on a theoretical basis, and we wanted to see how indicators of good care developed theoretically correspond to better outcomes. So this was a sort of validation of indicators through real world data. We also wanted to test whether better outcomes correspond to offer of timely and continuous interventions. To what extent timely and continuous intervention can produce better outcomes. We were also worried of gap in treatment, particularly in psychosocial and psychological gap in treatment. So how many people do really receive psychosocial interventions, and what could be done to have them more offered in the services. Information systems used to manage health services in each Italian region were the sources of our data. Information systems contain information on the population served, including diagnosis and discharge from hospital, drug prescriptions, specialist visits, and diagnostic procedures when they are reimbursable by the national health system. Psychiatric care is managed separately, and databases provide demographic and diagnosis information in each region, and information about the intervention given by the mental health services. Fortunately for us, these two systems can be merged, can be linked, and we can have a wide array of information about the same individual, of health information about the same individual. We got the databases from 3 large regions in Italy and 1 province, overall covering 37% of the entire Italian population. It has almost 22 million people who are by default beneficiaries of the national health system. We wanted to focus on incident cases. So we had to select the group of incident cases from a wider group of cases, and we used 3 criteria to select this population. They were excluded if they had received a previous diagnosis of schizophrenic disorder, had experienced at least 1 hospital admission to a psychiatric ward, and had received at least 2 prescriptions of antipsychotic drugs in the 2 years before the index date, because we had this information. So we got a sample of more than 12,000 patients who are considered newly taken into care in the period between January 2015 and June 2016. Individual data on outpatient and inpatient services provided by the National Health System could be linked to the data provided by the let's say psychiatric databases, as said. As outcome, because we wanted to see the effect of the offer of interventions on the outcome, as outcome we decided to use the hospital admissions as a proxy of relapse occurrence. The analysis was conducted with a self-controlled case series design. We are aware that the cohort approach often generates estimated affected by between-person confounding, because patients who have more severe conditions at baseline are more likely to receive more intervention and more timely and in a more continuous way, but more frequently, this same patient experience relapse and worse outcome. So this generates a paradox, which is almost impossible to eliminate with the traditional analysis. So this design allows a within-patient self-control analysis, which is aimed at eliminating between-person confounding. The population of this group, of this cohort, was a population who experienced both periods of exposure and non-exposure to mental health care, and had at least 1 relapse in order to estimate the effect on the indicator. Briefly, this is these are the basic characteristics of this large sample of people. We had a little bit more men. People, this was anyway quite aged population, poorly educated, mostly unemployed or retired, 70% lived with the family, and 56% was unmarried, was never married, let's say, plus 8% separated or divorced. These are our results, our core results. You see two survival curves. The one reflects the timeliness of psychosocial intervention, and the second, the timeliness on antipsychotic drug therapy. You have several lines in each graph because you have the 3 regions and the province of Palermo, and in the black bold line you have all the sample together. You can easily see that after 12 months of intake of care, 82% and 33% of the cohort members had not yet started treatment with psychosocial intervention and antipsychotic drug therapy, respectively. So many more patients had received antipsychotic treatment, whereas only a minority, 18%, had received some form of psychosocial intervention after 1 year they started their contact with the service. Continuity, so that was timeliness. Continuity of psychosocial intervention concerned 15% of patients and 27% for antipsychotic therapy. So this means that they experience long period of interruption between treatments. We have many years, person years of follow-up, and the overall incidence of relapse was 18.3 relapses every 100 person year. But we have to consider that there was quite a high variability, heterogeneity across the regions, with a minimum of less than 9 incident rate in the province of Palermo, and about threefold increased rate in Emilia-Romagna. These two graphs describe the risk of relapse according to treatment offer. In the first graph, on your left, we consider as a reference category the periods where people do not receive any outpatient care, which is an aspecific care. It's not psychosocial intervention, it's not drug therapy, it's just ordinary contact which doesn't produce any specific care. So in this reference category, corresponding to a risk of 1, we have periods where people do not receive any outpatient care and do not receive any drug therapy. When people receive drug therapy, we have a 30% decrease of the risk of relapse. When people receive only any outpatient care, aspecific, non-specific care, there is a non-significant increase in the relapse, risk of relapse. When people receive both intervention, any outpatient care and drug therapy, there is eventually no difference compared to the reference category. But what says us more is this second graph on your right, describing what happened in psychosocial interventions and with offer of psychosocial intervention and drug therapy. The reference category is here corresponds to the periods where the person do not receive any psychosocial intervention and any drug therapy. When in the second bar, we see the reduction in risk in people who receive only drug therapy and no psychosocial intervention. So the reduction in risk is 24%. When people do not receive any drug therapy, but receive psychosocial intervention, the reduction in risk is a little bit more marked, but largely overlapping with that of with the former one, and it corresponds to a reduction in risk of 28%. We have about half risk when both interventions are offered at the same time in the period when the person received both type of intervention. This is the description of our result I have already given. The core elements for the discussion of this data is that the number of people who receive psychosocial interventions at least once in the first year after intake was limited to 18%. And psychosocial intervention were not only seldom offered, but frequently discontinued, with only 15% continuing treatment for at least 2 years after the beginning. So the relapse occurrence was the second important finding, is that the relapse occurrence was reduced during periods covered by psychosocial interventions at a little greater extent compared to when covered by drug therapy alone. And this does not happen at all when people was offered to any a specific care. Psychosocial intervention are the core of community care because they prove to be the most protective from the risk of relapse. But together with this, we have also shown that continuing use of both psychosocial interventions and antipsychotic drug therapy reduces the risk of relapse in people with schizophrenia spectrum disorders of about half. So this means that we have we are wasting the possibility to reach great results in terms of relapses in people with severe mental disorders, missing when not providing psychosocial interventions, which is given to a real minority of patients. So these results are not alone in underlying that it is probably really time to overcome a basically pharmacological oriented education and practice in the care of schizophrenia, and particularly in the first phases of illness. So this result is not new, but we think it is new in terms of real world data, availability of real world data. So what happens in reality, the type of analysis we have conducted, and also the clarity of these results. So administrative data have proven to be very useful to assess the effectiveness of a mental health system in the absence of ad hoc data collection. So it is difficult to collect ad hoc data, and it is paramount to make the better use of available data. But still we need better information about mental health care real coverage. In fact, we do not have any outcomes reported by professional and by patients, so we have to limit our analysis to the estimate to the risk of relapse. and we do not have information about how care is delivered, how the quality of the care offered in terms of duration, intensity, fidelity, accuracy, and appropriateness. Also, we regret not having any form of user opinion about quality of care. In spite of these limits, we think that we have had the opportunity to confirm something that is already known, but still it is difficult to produce different services and the implementation of what really can more benefit patients. Many thanks.
Thank you, Dr.
Well, let me introduce the second speaker of this session. Actually, this was supposed to be the third one, but the second one seems to be sick, so couldn't join us. Dr. Lakshmi has completed MBBS from the University of Raipur in India, and she's currently a final year resident pursuing psychiatry at NIMHANS, the Institute of Mental Health in Bangalore, India. I have said she, but I'm not sure because there is no first name here. So Dr. Lakshmi, please complete your presentation, and I apologize for that if this is incomplete. Please.
Warm greetings to one and all. So today I'll be presenting on the topic of my research, what after me issues in parents of persons with mild intellectual disability. Myself, I'm Dr. Lakshmi J. I'm junior resident in MD Psychiatry in NIMHANS, National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, Bangalore. Coming to the background of my study, persons with intellectual disability outlive their parents due to their increased life expectancy over the last few decades. So they require continuity of care even after the parent's death or incapacitation. Thus, future care planning after the parent's death or incapacitation is a sensitive and complex issue. This is also an emerging problem in India due to the breakdown of joint family system into more nuclear families and also due to urbanization. Earlier, there was a concept of shared caregiving in the joint family system, which is reducing due to the nuclear family system in India. So there is a need for Indian studies on what after me issues in parents with adults with mild intellectual disability. So coming to the objectives of my study, so to study the nature of what after me concerns of parents of adults with mild intellectual disability, and also to study the contextual factors, that is familial, individual, and parental characteristics associated with what after me concerns. Another objective was to study the plans made by the parents of these adults to address the what after me issues, and also to study the extent to which parents perceive that their needs could be met by the provisions under National Trust Act 1999. So coming to the inclusion and exclusion criteria for my study, the inclusion criteria are as follows. Parents, that is both father and mother of adults with ICD-10 diagnosis of mild intellectual disability who express what after me concerns were recruited. And age of what should be between 18 to 40 years, and severity of the intellectual disability should be in the mild category. Exclusion criteria were as follows. Parents with intellectual disability or parent who is not willing to give informed consent were excluded. and single parents were excluded. Parents with a PHQ score, that is patient health questionnaire score greater than 9, that is who have clinical depression, were excluded. And adults with mild intellectual disability having medical comorbidities requiring priority management, who have comorbid pervasive developmental disorders, or who has comorbid mental illness when they are symptomatic, were excluded from the study. Coming to the methodology. So first, literature review was done and focus group discussion with 3 groups were done. That is first with mental health professionals, second with NGO staffs, and third with parents. Out of the information from the literature review and the focus group discussions, semi-structured interview schedule was developed. Parents of 4 males and 4 females were recruited with informed consent, and PHQ 9 was applied on the parent, and parent was recruited only if their score was less than 9, that is when there is no clinical depression. Qualitative interview of parents were done using semi-structured interview schedule through either video conferencing software or telephone, depending on the feasibility. Interviews were audio or video recorded depending on the platform on which the interviews were conducted, and the interviews were transcribed. Thematic analysis was done using Atlas TI software, and then it was coded by 2 researchers independently, and discrepancy was resolved by the 3rd researcher. Coming to the results of the study. First, coming to the results of the focus group discussions, then we would go on to the results of the semi-structured interview schedule. Focus group discussion, first discussion was with MHPs. MHPs told that we as mental health professionals should initiate discussion on what after me when the child's developmental limit has been arrived at. And MHPs should also be sensitive to the caregiver's needs and their mental preparation to accept the situation. Second FGD was done with parents, and the following were the results. What after me issues should be discussed. According to the parents, it should be discussed within the first few sessions after diagnosis to facilitate better planning. This was as opposed to what we saw in FGD with mental health professionals. And parents also want MHPs to provide more information and guidance through accessible online websites. The third FGD was done with NGO staffs, and these were the results. NGO staffs usually facilitate access to government benefits. NGO staffs opined that government should increase the number and size of group homes, and there was a need for effective implementation of the existing schemes under National Trust, and Family Federation is the ideal solution, as the NGO staffs opined. Coming to the results of the semi-structured interview schedule. Nature of what after me issues were the first theme that was found, and which was also our objective, and the following sub-themes emerged. Precipitating and exacerbating factors, that is, these are the factors which either cause or increase the what after me issue in parents. Some parents reported that these concerns were present since birth. Some reported that this appeared when there was a lack of catch-up of the special child with other neurotypical peers, or when the sibling moved out of the home for higher education, or when the sibling got married, or when there were financial constraints. For example, due to COVID, there was loss of job and financial constraints in some families, which actually exacerbated the what after me issues. And also when there is a death of a significant family member. These were some of the precipitating and exacerbating factors for some parents. The second sub-theme being the concerns about guardian. So parents expected that the guardian should look after the ward just like how the parents did in their lifetime. And their parents reported of challenges in identifying a trustworthy guardian. And prospective spouse as a guardian was also considered by most of the parents who had adult male children with intellectual disability. And it was also noted that parents with female special children did not think of marriage as an option for guardian. Financial concerns were also one of the sub-themes that emerged. And parents reported a difficulty in affordability of the residential care centers in terms of the monthly recurring cost and the funding, that is the initial deposit required for enrolling in the residential care centers. And residential concerns included concerns whether food preferences would be met in the residential care center, and whether there would be gainful engagement of the wards with intellectual disability during the day in the residential care center was some of the concerns expressed by the parents. Next one is the safety concerns. So parents expected that the ward should be protected from abuse, parents expressed this concern more in case of females than in case of males. Okay, and then coming to the employment concerns. Employment can help the ward in many ways according to the parents, and employment can help them financially to attain financial stability. Employment can help in keeping the ward gainfully engaged, and it also can help in reducing the behavioral issues. Coming to the contextual factors affecting waterotomy issues, as you can see in this slide, there are different factors: individual factors, parental, familial, and environmental factors which can affect waterotomy issues, that is either increase or decrease waterotomy issues. We also found that COVID-19 was one of the factors, environmental factors, which increased waterotomy issues in parents. It can be in the form of difficulty in communication with the prospective guardian, increase in uncertainty of the parents' own lives, increasing whether parents started doubting about their own life expectancy, which further increased the waterotomy concern. Coming to the parental plans, which was the third objective of the study. Parental plans were as follows. There was a plan for guardianship. Guardianship was always considered as a family affair in most of the families who were interviewed. And their first preference for the guardian was the sibling, which was followed by if sibling was not available, or sibling is abroad, or sibling is not ready. So then their next preference would be the extended family members. Marriage was also considered as a plan by by some of the parents and all of the parents who had adult male special children, and only 1 out of the 8 persons with ID had a guardianship certificate. Financial plans, poor parents didn't have a financial plan when we interviewed them, and other parents who were in a better position had set aside some property, had some fixed deposits. Some of them had made facilities for pension transfer. Others had arranged medical insurance schemes for their adult wards with intellectual disability. Third plan included the residential plan. Most of the parents wanted their children to live in their own home with direct or indirect supervision. The second option was for the ward to live in the siblings' home, and the third option being the residential care center. Some people even told that they left the things to God, and they believed that God would take care when the time comes, when they had not planned. And in the discussion with mental health professionals, FGD, it also came up that when the parents actually passed away without adequate plans, still the sibling came and took over the child, took over the ward with intellectual disability, or if when the sibling was not available, extended family members had taken the responsibility. So next plan is the vocational plan. Parents also had made plans for the person with ID for his gainful engagement in the day, and also for involvement in a job. So coming to the fourth objective, to find out the extent to which parents perceive their needs could be met by National Trust provisions. So less than 50% of the parents interviewed were aware of the National Trust standard schemes. So it was explained during the interview regarding the provisions regarding the provisions which are available under National Trust. And after explanation, some parents reported that guardianship, Garounda, that is long stay home facilities, and Niramaya, that is health insurance schemes, would be helpful for addressing the waterotomy issues. But more parents also reported that they wanted more time to think about scheme utility, because this was the first time that they had heard about the National Trust standards provisions. Parents also reported what were the supports required from the government and from the mental health professionals. From the government, these were as follows. Parents wanted the government to increase the disability pension, to increase the capacity and number of Garounda centers, that is long stay homes in the country, and also to provide a permanent job for their ward with intellectual disability. And from the mental health professionals, they expected that mental health professionals would facilitate a permanent job for the person with ID. And they also wanted easy access to consultations, like a separate OPD for the persons with intellectual disability, so that they would not have to stand in long queues because of behavioral disturbances, which is difficult for them to stand actually. So next thing that they expected is from the MHPs to facilitate access to government benefits. Coming to discussion, future care planning should address guardianship, financial, residential, and vocational aspects. Planning happens over multiple sessions and involves different stakeholders. Mental health professionals should educate parents about National Trust schemes and facilitate access to these schemes. Finally, coming to the information provided to the subjects during the interview, all the domains of planning, including guardianship, residence, and finance, were explained to the patient, to the parents, and regarding how to apply for guardianship and its benefits, and information regarding long stay homes were also provided for the parents. Parents were also explained about the about pension transfer and how to plan for 2 generations in terms of finances. Welfare benefits available in India, including the disability certification and others, were also explained. National trust schemes were explained via screen share during the online interview through Zoom, and also the website details, and also was shared to them over mail. And future care planning tools were also shown to them via screen share, and all these documents, including the pamphlets, including website details, including some photos of some books, were shared to them via mail for further use. So that's all. These are my references. Thank you for your kind listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lakshmi, for your very interesting presentation. Now let me introduce Dr. Anna Felker from Milan, like me. She's a psychiatrist and anthropologist. She has a PhD in ethnology and anthropology. She works in the public mental health services near Milan, and she is also committed in long-standing NGO taking care of people, of refugees and people with or asylum seekers. And in these sessions, she is going to present the right to choose their own care, part 2, even vaccinations. So this will be a video recorded presentation.
The right to choose their own care, part 2, even vaccinations. 3 years ago, I talked about the pressing and the frequent requests that some patients do, asking for the possibility to choose, after informations, their own pharmacotherapy. Our way of act, especially with psychotic people, is not a question about what do they prefer after our suggestions, but is often an imposing therapy that we know from the protocol that they can't really discuss. Now, after the pandemic experience, people who are asking for choosing their own care becoming bigger and bigger, and the request is not only from our patients. I would like to think about the situation and understand thoughts that move this request. I took suggestions from philosopher, anthropologist, politician, and the real fact of a psychiatric patient. When she was forced to go into therapy, she made a suicide. The right to choose their own care is one of the topics invoked in the pressing and frequent requests that do some patients. From the document on patients' rights, I know the practical difficulties in keeping faith with those intentions. In the year 2018, some researchers have revised some articles with the aim to improve this right in practice. From the anthropological view, there is a discussion around the idea of the state of exception. That is a concept introduced in the 1920s by the German philosopher and jurist Carl Schmitt and Giorgio Agamben right now. Similar to a state of emergency, martial law, but based in the sovereign's ability to question the rule of the law in the name of the public good. The right to choose our health system, an organization and the common management with many of other Western culture systems within we operate forces us sometimes to make choices that do not take into account the possibility of exception, but usually just standard choices. Also in the psychiatric care experience, we often have the problem to oblige someone to be hospitalized because of her or him acute state. In my report, through the narration of a clinical case, I illustrate this contradiction. One special and dramatic clinical case shows what I want to say with the night rise. Sarah was a 40-year-old woman when I met her in my ward. She had already tried to be treated from all of other doctors in the same place. She always stopped her pharmacotherapy in any occasion when she was obliged to take it, even when she was without any kind of psychotic symptoms. The drugs gave her bad side effects and was difficult to her even work. In the same time, when she stopped the therapy, she also stopped to meet psychiatrists and any other health worker in the clinic. So it was very difficult to build a sort of a minimum therapeutic relationship and a sort of a good patient-doctor confidence. Good started because I was agreed in accordance with Dr. Moncrief says to use pharmacotherapy only when the symptoms stopped, and usually it was once or twice per year. She had a daughter that at that time was 80 or 10 years old, and then was the problem of everything rotated around. She really loved her, and she could do anything for her. During the next 8 years, our relationship was very good, even there were difficulties and tensions in the moment of the psychotic crisis. Most of the time, the crisis started because of her husband's relationship. He accused her to fight too much with him and to have too many crises to be a good mother for their daughter. He asked to the public service for minor children to see what's going on. One day, she told me if they obliged me to take medicine, otherwise they took my daughter, I leave her to them. I don't want to be blackmailed and forced for anything and from anybody. The minor children's service took her daughter and gave her to the father. They also forced Sarah to take medicine, otherwise she never could see her daughter. So Sarah took a medicine like a long-term therapy and asked many times to have her daughter back. That was for more than 14 months, and always the answer was, Wait, the judge has still to decide. But it was too much for Sarah, and she decided to commit a suicide. Her daughter was 17 years old. The discussion at theoretical point of view. The therapeutic intervention case is to be calibrated on the patient and to adapt on their requirements and start to be detected by the system that builds anonymous proof. The production of a medical knowledge conducted within our academics leads formally to consider the patient at the center of the care, but conveys imperatives that consider legitimate only the intervention with a range of standardized protocols. So it's not only from the outside, from the point of the patient, but also from inside, from the point of doctors, the biopower works. In our work, it's very difficult to try to propose a different kind of a therapeutic approach because we should follow the protocol part. So, what is this famous biopower? Foucault started to talk about biopower, showing how strong is power of medicine in the society just after the power of pharmacy and religion. Talking about the biopower, the author mentioned two kinds of movement, the one of leprosy and the one of plague. The management of leprosy and the plague has two distinct modalities of control and organization, whereas the former required the leper's exclusion from society. The latter installed a disciplinary mechanism that mobilized society in its totality. The political dream of plague is the miraculous moment when political power is exercised to the full. Plague is the moment when the spatial partition and subdivision of the population is taken to its extreme point. In through, the plague is met by order, discipline, and control. In the first lecture of 1978, Foucault identified the smallpox or inoculation model as one focused neither or on exclusion nor on quarantine, but rather on epidemic and medical campaign trying to stop it. With this third model, the point is no longer to establish purity or discipline, but rather security, management of risk. No longer that of fixing, demarcating the territory, but rather that of allowing circulation to take place, controlling them, shifting the good and bad, ensuring that things are always in movement, constantly moving around, continually going from one point to another, but in such a way that the inherent dangers of this circulation are cancelled out. The technologies of security respond to the risk without presuming to eliminate them, but rather aiming and containing and regulating them. Even in a critical reading of Carl Smith theory, deception is identified as the original juridical political structure. Exemption is the way in which the law claims power over the existent and in particular over life by including the existent with itself or external to. Agamben calls the inclusive exclusion to which the law creates a zone of indistinction between outside and inside, and thereby secure its hold on life. The law always functions as a state of exception. In this panorama, what we see is that there is an important risk for democracy. This is the main and vivid concern of world liberal democratic intelligence around the world, to the point that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned in April 2020 that the COVID crisis was fast becoming a human rights crisis. What worries the liberal democratics minds is that the an expression limitation on personal freedoms adopted to fight the pandemic abuse on them in some way and degree will be normalized and remain in place after the crisis, transforming democratic life in a world that exception becomes the rule. This recommendation could be used even for our overuse protocol or mandatory therapy, often used because of frequent complaints from a medical security point of view, as the way we work with a sort of a human rights crisis. Conclusion, what worries the liberal democratics the liberal democratic mind is the limitation on personal freedoms adopted in the pandemic, with that is the abuse, and then in some way and degree normalize and remain in place after the crisis, transforming democratic life in a world that exception becomes the rule. From an anthropological point of view, we can use a small and local example to explain a global way to cure. The psychiatry institution is invested by society itself in order to safeguard and protect the community from any subject or situation that could alter its equilibrium.
Okay, very well. Thank you, Dr. Falker, for this very demanding and interesting presentation. We do not have any question from the audience, so we might exchange ideas and ask a few questions for a few minutes. Do you have any question for the other presentations, or shall I ask some questions? Dr. Falker, Dr. Lakshmi? No, not at the moment.
Well, I can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make a question to Barbara and about her work. I just want to know if your presentation is on a study that is long, 1 year and some months, right? I just want to know. And I just want to know if you want to reply this this study, and also to analyze other kind of therapy, like not just not the social rehabilitation, but also, for example, the psychological rehabilitation, or maybe another kind of therapy. Can you have an idea about that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Fraker, for this question. Well, these are data derived from the administrative databases. So the databases which are organized by the region, which pays for the activities of the mental health services, and are organized according to a quite rigid list of interventions, which I'm sure you know, as you are a professional of this same system. So the interventions we could take into consideration are those listed and as interventions which can be paid by the region to the services. In the definition of psychosocial interventions, we also had psychological interventions. We had psychoeducation, and we also had psychological interventions. But it was impossible to have a more fine category, more detailed, to have more detailed categories of interventions. This study was done using the interventions delivered in the year 2015 and 2016, part of 2016. This because of very technical reasons. We could just go behind for that duration, for that time. So, of course, these databases are organized in such a way which does not allow to go behind a very long time. And we also need to wait for them to be available to researchers. Anyway, it may be useful to replicate this analysis on databases from other regions in Italy, but also other countries, even if the system is somehow different. It would also be interesting to replicate the analysis after a few years in order to see whether the new knowledge and information which are tackling the need of psychosocial interventions and the effectiveness of psychosocial interventions, to see whether these have informed real practice. And so we might check whether in reality the knowledge gained through research has produced a change. Actually, we are also doing this with other illnesses, not only with schizophrenic spectrum disorders. If there are no questions from the side of Dr. Lakshmi, I have a simple question for her. Congratulations for the issue you have decided to address, and for your presentation, and for the work done. I just would like to know, what is the destiny normally for people with mild disability in the absence of a After Us program fully implemented.
Decisions can be made by them, by the guardian. So it's better that they have a guardianship certificate. So what I have told is that there were 8 patients, 4 males and 4 females, out of which only one of them had a guardianship certificate. The others did not have it, even though they knew about it. So that was just on that basis.
And what is
Basically,
sorry, please.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am, you were telling something?
Yes, I was going to, what are the barriers to have a guardianship? What do you think are the barriers to have a guardianship?
So the thing is, first, even though they have a guardian who is available to take up the responsibilities, one is the knowledge about the guardianship scheme and the government facilities that are available are less in many of the parents, even if they are in touch with one of in national institutes or central hospitals. So that is one thing is regarding the awareness. Another thing is regarding the other barriers, like if they require a lot of documents, and also to go at regular intervals to the government facility, and to also know about the timings at which these are done, and to get all this together is also a problem. And in India, as it is a middle income country, so there are a lot of implementation difficulties which are there by the government at the lower levels. So that is one of the barrier.
The process is seriously challenging. Well, I think both these presentations has given very interesting clues. I think it was very interesting to be informed about this reality from India, and have some prompts from a theoretical and philosophical and ethical point of view by Dr. Felker. And she reminded us how much the everyday practice is embedded in very crucial questions, which are often forgotten, but more often are too challenging to be faced and to be faced every day. I do not think there is. So I thank Dr. Felker for this. I think we do not have an answer in front of these contradictions, dramatic contradictions, but it is important to be aware, not to think, to be aware of this contradiction and of these pillars, theoretical pillars of the work of psychiatry, but also to brush up all this and be really aware of the difficulties in practice that professionals are forced to deal in practice. So many thanks for these interventions, and I wish a good continuation of the conference.
Okay, thank you very much to you.
Consideration from the City of Bergen, experience with recovery and peer support work. Learning objectives in this presentation. We will talk about the importance of peer support workers in the City of Bergen, roles and tasks of peer support workers, peer support and recovery, a history of experience from a peer support worker, why guidance to peer support workers is important. My name is Anne Turid Nygaard, and I'm a nurse and a social anthropologist and have lived experience. I work in Agency for Mental Health and Substance Abuse Service in Bergen, Norway. I'm working together with Irene Angelsgaard. She's a peer support worker in a low threshold service in the city, and she's also a Gestalt therapist. We have co-produced this presentation together. Peer support workers is valued colleagues. Lived experience as a resource has been essential in services for citizens with mental health and substance abuse challenges in Norway, in Bergen. This dynamics in the services with experts by experience and experts by expertise is of great value. Already in 2005, the City of Bergen developed a specific education for people with lived experience who wanted to work as peers. This program aims to help the students to better understand the role of being peer support worker. This education has given the mental health services in Bergen sufficient access to qualified peer support workers. Today, we have employed more than 50 peer support workers in our services. Peer support workers have also established their own national union, which will work for increasing competence, better working conditions, and sharing of experience. It is estimated that there are more than 400 peer support workers in Norway now, and the number is growing. This shows that peer support is perceived as an important professional contribution to our field. We have experienced that professionals learn from the perspectives, creativity, and insight the colleagues with lived experience may convey, but it takes time to change perspective and for professionals to reduce the power. Constant focus is important. We have learned that professionals learn to appreciate to work side by side with peer support workers, and the demand for their expertise is rising. Roles and tasks. Peer support workers is employed based on their own perceived and clarified history of mental health and substance abuse. Peer support workers are important in the development of this field because it promotes user participation, equality and can help to reduce stigma. It's a key tool for strengthening the user perspective and promoting the recovery perspective of colleagues in the services. Healthcare professionals and peer support workers are expert in separate fields, and the ideal is to achieve equality of the two fields of knowledge. The combination of expertise by experience and professional knowledge can make the services better. When these fields interact, share experiences and ideas, learn from each other, and are respectful, this can result in a stronger community and a more generous mental health and substance abuse service. Typical tasks for peer support workers in our services. To help people who are struggling to gain an increased degree of hope for recovery, strengthen recovery perspective, strengthen service user participation in it, and ensure that their voice is heard clearly in service development. Assist in low threshold services and be a support to people who need it. Be a door opener for service user organizations into the mental health and substance abuse service. Be a sparring partner for colleagues, teaching colleagues and new employees about different challenges related to living with mental health issues. Use advocacy to help service users to fulfill their rights. Studies have shown that peer support workers contribute to better access to relevant services, reduced use of emergency services, substance abuse decrease, increased hope among service users, and increased well-being in everyday life. Peer support workers can more easily than professionals relate to relevant problems, help and collaboration become more authentic, and empathy is often perceived as more authentic and real compared to professionals. Now, Irene will continue the presentation.
Peer support and recovery. Recovery, in our understanding, is a deeply personal and unique process, but it is also connected to social interaction. To support personal recovery involves shifting focus from addressing health challenges to promoting wellness. Framework for personal recovery is explained as hope as a frequent self-reported component of recovery, self-identity, including current and future self-image, meaning in life, including life purpose and goals, personal responsibility, the ability to take personal responsibility for one's own lives. I am employed as a peer support worker at a low threshold place in Norway, Bergen. My position enables me to convey hope and compassion to people who have challenges with perceptions, cognitions, and affect. I work from a place of authenticity without a personal agenda, while staying attuned to people's feelings, perceptions, and interests. My co-workers appreciate my perspective, which creates an environment of safety for me to reflect upon and draw knowledge from my experience. The safety I feel with my co-workers is important because it empowers me to bring safety and trust to those we work for. Throughout my life, I have adapted to my surroundings by altering my behavior, my opinion, and the way I act. I haven't seen myself as good enough and felt a lot of shame while interacting with others. Today, I believe the shame was present as a signal for interpersonal danger, preventing me from the reaction and criticism I feared. This self-protection shaped my identity by hiding everything I was ashamed for in myself. This was a spiral of hiding my inside from everyone on the outside, so crucial that with time, even I didn't know who I was, how I felt, or what I liked. People, obsessions, self-help groups, psychosis, 12 steps programs, drug, and therapy all contributed to my recovery path by showing me glimpses of my inside from the outside. But it was all just glimpses that I desperately got addicted to, convinced they were my outside solution for the pain and loneliness I felt inside. Nevertheless, my outside had to be secure and predictable before I could get in touch with my inside. True recovery for me is to connect with the outside from the embodied inside. This is a state of being that increases my presence and compassion in all my professional and personal interactions. The contrast from my former shame-based life to the present day as a peer support worker is gigantic. What was hidden to me in my past is with me today as the source of my knowledge and reflection. Throughout my life, I have come to understand various defense mechanisms and underlying emotion. All the challenges I have faced in life have contributed to my perceptions, insight, and understanding. But my identity is not defined by my narrative. My identity is defined by my own qualities, my beliefs, attention, and awareness. User experience was not turned into experience competence by itself, nor do I think this is a competence that remains of its own. For my experience to remain at benefit in work, I must rethink my position as a peer support worker. This rethinking is best done with others, and preferably on a regular basis with a peer support worker who also have a degree in supervision. Without professional guidance from a peer support worker, I find it difficult to keep my experience by expertise alive and useful. If none of my co-workers share my view in discussions, I quickly become doubtful of my own opinions. The shameful feeling that regulated me for so long to not think or feel authentically with others always seems ready to take back control. To avoid being isolated in my own shame, it's important that I receive ongoing support and guidance. To use lived experience as a tool is a special and different perspective to work from compared to professionals, because it's the painful experience from a peer support worker that is used to educate and develop the services. It is expected that examples from a troublesome history shall be shared. Therefore, it's of great importance that the colleagues with lived experience have a clarified relationship with their own suffering. A peer support worker is hired to use their personal history and thereby to use that history as their base of knowledge and profession. Therefore, it is of utterly importance that the professional guidance must be built on both knowledge of experience and professional supervision. Experience have demonstrated that lived experience can be a tool to keep focus on recovery and equal relationship between formal expertise and lived experience. Instead of diagnosis and deviance, the focus is on resources, hope, meaning, and opportunities, and can lead to positive change in stigmatization attitudes and culture in the organization. Thank you all so much for your attention.
My name is Pooja Gupta and I am a PhD scholar at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bangalore. In this paper today, what we want to discuss is how recovery is a deeply personal journey, and it can be seen as a way of living a satisfying life despite the limitations caused by illness. So specifically when we look at persons with severe mental illness, it is seen that recovery does not go in a very linear fashion. And what we mean. Hello everyone. Today I'll be presenting a paper that's titled Recovery Beyond Pharmacotherapy on the behalf of all my authors. And my name is Pooja Gupta and I'm a PhD scholar at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bangalore. In this paper today, what we want to discuss is how recovery is a deeply personal journey, and it can be seen as a way of living a satisfying life despite the limitations caused by illness. So specifically when we look at persons with severe mental illness, it is seen that recovery does not go in a very linear fashion. And what we mean by that is that not just that there are situations where there is progress, where there is some kind of improvement, and then there might be some relapse, not just in clinical terms, but even in terms of functioning. It is also that there are these various phases, and there seem to be these various phases that individuals need to go through. And these phases can also become, places where persons do get stuck. Right, and it seems like things are not moving ahead or not moving forward till sort of like a critical sort of situation is reached. So with these kind of recovery journeys, it's also important to notice that there are multiple factors that seem to be affecting this. It's not just the illness or the symptoms, but it's also the socio-demographic factors, the family factors, and there seem to be a lot of determinants that come together to determine this kind of a recovery journey that happens in the lives of persons with severe mental illness. And this is exactly these similarities and differences is exactly what we want to emphasize on in today's paper. And therefore we sort of use we are sort of utilizing the case histories of 3 patients who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia and have had a long duration of illness, and who are receiving long-term care for rehabilitation specifically. And using these case histories and life journeys, we actually want to highlight what are some of the similarities and differences that seem to be coming up when we look at individual journeys of recovery, especially in persons with severe mental illness. So jumping right into it, we would start with the first patient, S1, who is a 38-year-old single male who has completed a master's degree. And he is from a middle socioeconomic background. He's currently residing with his parents, and he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia about 10 years ago. While he is able to manage all his activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living, and additionally, he also works as a freelance content writer. He used to hold another job earlier, but due to the pandemic, he was unable to continue doing that. He was able to switch off to different work role that did not require him to go outside. So this particular job role, which is that of a content writer, has actually helped him to work from home, to support himself, and he is actually able to transition to this different kind of working very smoothly. So with regards to his clinical history, while he was diagnosed with schizophrenia 10 years ago, he had also been diagnosed with depression a few years before that. However, as far as his symptoms are concerned, he has been in remission for at least for the last 4 years. Earlier, he was enrolled as a day boarder within this rehabilitation facility, where what we mean by a day boarder is someone who'd come in the day and would utilize or work in some of the various sections in the rehabilitation services unit. And these sections are typically very vocationally oriented. They sort of train the individuals in various skills that can help them develop their own working sort of knowledge of situations, of how to do those kind of works, and also develop a sense of discipline and timeliness within themselves, developing social skills, developing working culture, and all of these things. So coming to this patient, he was enrolled as a day porter for quite a few years, and he worked in the bakery section in the end, but he was also enrolled in other sections before that. His review from all of his instructors there was that he was a very dedicated participant. He would always be on time. He was very particular about the work that he'd do, and he would ensure to the best of his capacities that he is able to finish the work in a good manner. And meet the goals that has been set for him. He had undergone vocational training while he was enrolled as a day porter, and initially he was a participant in a supported employment program, and later on he was able to transition to working on his own as he shifted back to his hometown and was no longer living here in Bangalore. So one unique aspect of his journey that we can see is that he is able to financially support himself. He is able to work adequately and manage his symptoms. However, he does feel deeply unsatisfied with the level of work that he's doing, with his own achievements, despite having done so much, and not just done a bachelor's degree, but also completed a master's degree. He seems to have a sense of it not being enough. And that sort of drives him to push himself more and to sort of do more as much as he can. Now, coming to the second case history, we'd see that of S2, who is a 42-year-old single male who has completed civil engineering. He is from a middle socioeconomic background, and he is currently residing with his father. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia 23 years ago, and he also is able to manage activities of daily living on his own. However, he has never worked in any kind of formal employment. And this has always been a sort of a point of conflict between him and his father, because the father feels that he can do such a thing, he can actually get into an employment, but the patient himself feels very satisfied with where he is right now and doesn't feel the need really, or any kind of drive or push to actually pursue any kind of formal employment or pursue any kind of earnings. In terms of his clinical symptoms, he has been in remission for the past 15 years, and currently he is a day boarder in the rehabilitation center here, and he is working in the bakery and the computer section, where he is being taught these skills. And the continued feedback from the instructors are that he is very particular in his work, he's extremely punctual, and he always ensures that he completes the work on time and to the adequate level. His father was a retired government employee, and they do get they are financially supported by the pension that they receive from the government. And there have been multiple attempts that have been made towards vocational training and supported employment for this patient. However, they have mostly been unsuccessful due to his own lack of interest and motivation to take part in any of these programs wholeheartedly. And this continues to remain a barrier towards further recovery goals for him. And the third case history that we're seeing is that of S3, who is a 57-year-old single male who has also completed his bachelor's in marine engineering. He is from a higher socioeconomic background and he resides with his father currently. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia approximately 36 years ago. Again, he's able to manage his activities of daily living on his own. And he has actually worked in multiple short-term work, which have mostly been administrative in nature. Also, additionally, he works part-time as a private insurance agent, which has also brought in some amount of financial security for him. He has, in terms of his clinical symptoms, he has been in remission for the last 15 years. And he was earlier enrolled as a day boarder in the rehabilitation services. However, currently he is not a day boarder here. His father is a retired private insurance agent, and to some extent, he is financially supported by his father and younger brother. He has also received vocational training at the institute and has been earlier successfully placed in jobs over the years. However, his employment was interrupted by the pandemic that did occur, and because of which he has taken up different temporary roles, mostly in administrative work, which would include paperwork, scheduling appointments, and all of these things. His continued feedback from his instructors earlier and his workplace presently is that he is able to complete the tasks on time. He is quite dedicated and particular in getting things done. And he's quite punctual in terms of his routine. So these are the three case vignettes that we wanted to share. And some of the common themes that we were able to identify across all of these were that they all three of them had very similar diagnosis and similar symptoms. However, one can see that their recovery trajectory seems to be very different. They seem to be, all three of them, while they are in remission, their symptoms have alleviated. However, their recovery journey seems to be influenced by multiple other factors, not just the factors that are related to the illness. So one of the influences that we could identify is that of financial security in the larger sense of the family. So while in some of the cases, the presence of independent income that supports the individual has not interrupted in their own pursuits of satisfying a vocation or career or living a fulfilling life, the same presence of a financial security has actually been a deterrent for another patient who seems to not feel the need really to progress or to actually take up more responsibilities. Another aspect that seems to be influencing is that of family support. So when we look at two of the patients, that's S1 and S3, we'd see that while both of them have been working, they've been doing relatively well in the workspace, contributing, being productive, their family members are also extremely supportive of them. And there seems to be a sort of open communication that exists, and they seem to be very reminding him of the micro gains that they keep making across their journeys. Whereas when we look at patient S2, we see that his family members are not as supportive of his progress and rather focus more on the areas that he has still not improved, or and there's a very high level of expressed emotions in that dynamic there that does influence the patient to not do more or take more responsibilities or stick his neck out to really get things done. There also seems to be a difference in the level of satisfaction that they seem to have. So while S2 and S3, who are at completely different phases of their recovery journeys, while both of them seem to be extremely satisfied with what they're doing currently, where they are, the S1 seems to actually be dissatisfied with the journey that he is on and the level that he's reached right now. And while in S1 and S2, we can see that this kind of a satisfaction actually can end up being a barrier to their further progress. For S1, it seems like he's unable to appreciate his gains, and that keeps him demotivated. That makes him scared of or uncertain of what's going to happen in the future, because he doesn't feel confident enough to deal with it. Whereas on the other hand, when we look at S2, there seems to be a higher level of satisfaction with where he is right now that actually reduces his drive to move ahead and keeps him stuck at this level of working or doing jobs that he is clearly overqualified for. And when he can clearly do more, he seems to be settling with less. So important things to take away from this exploration of these three cases is that recovery is a personal journey marred by multiple ups and downs. And as mental health professionals, it's very important that we keep a keen eye on the various influencing factors that seem to be affecting the unique stories of individuals that we come across. So there isn't a one model fit all kind of approach that we can really take here. However, it's important to identify what is happening in the various areas across a person's life and to see how uniquely it might be affecting and influencing their recovery goals and their recovery journeys. And this kind of individualistic approach can actually help us recognize barriers and promote a better recovery. And another aspect that we could identify is that in the Indian context, especially, one could see that as a mental health professional in the rehabilitation space, we are required to negotiate and balance between the goals of the individual and the goals of the caregiver, because they both seem to be, they both can be extremely different. They both can be sometimes at loggerheads with each other. And it's very important for us to be able to balance this and to actually understand and figure out which direction do we go to, what is it that the patient would like to do, and how do we facilitate a larger progress towards recovery goal for both the patient and the caregiver. So it's a balancing act that we as mental health professionals need to follow. And yeah, I think these are some of our takeaways. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share our learnings with you.